It was the end of September 1916, World War I. In the mountains of East Africa, German Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck was about to be surrounded. In front of him were nearly 1,000 British forces. Behind him, a thicket of death traps, the African wilderness. For years, von Lettow and his German troops had been playing a game of cat and mouse against the British over hundreds of miles of harsh African terrain, a game von Lettow had always won. But the tables had finally turned. And with von Lettow nearly trapped, the British gave him a choice: surrender or die. He chose neither. Instead, von Lettow melted into the tangled forest behind him, and in the blink of an eye, was gone.
Here is a man who fights the war continuously, right from the very beginning in 1914, right to the end in 1918. He tweaks the lion's tail. The British aren't able to deal with him. He goes all over East Africa with people following him and never quite catching him.
Von Lettow is cut from the cloth of the traditional military hero. He could be one of these great figures out of your childhood storybooks, riding through the bush at the head of his ragged band of dedicated troops, fighting off a vastly superior foe, but always doing it with a gleam in his eye and a chivalrous attitude. He was one of the last great romantic figures in the history of war.
(1914). The long days of summer ended in an explosion of cannon fire as World War I broke out across Europe. 6 million men took off for the Western Front, 4 million for the Eastern Front. And half a world away, a ragtag group of less than 3,000 reported for duty along the Forgotten Front, East Africa. Just months earlier, Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck had been dispatched to German East Africa with orders to defend it in case of attack. But when he arrived, war was the last thing on anyone's mind. The leaders of Europe's African colonies, including British, German, Portuguese, and Belgian territories, had collectively agreed that if war broke out in Europe, they would keep the colonies neutral.
Everyone expected a European war to be short and decisive, and everyone had a stake in preserving the economies of their colonies. In particular, all European powers were greatly worried that if they tried to fight a war in Africa, this would provoke a general rebellion among native populations in Africa.
But unlike his colonial bosses, von Lettow was spoiling for a fight.
This war was about the homeland, about victory or defeat, about our national future. Our fight was about achieving total victory.
At the beginning of the war, Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck was attempting to look for a classic German decisive battle. He was from a Prussian military background, an aristocratic Prussian military background. His father was a general in the German army. He had been raised in the military culture. He was a professional officer through and through, and that came across very much in his personality.
Despite the neutrality agreement, von Lettow still hoped for a chance to show his Kaiser back home what he was made of. That opportunity came in November of 1914, when the British, in a hasty power grab, violated neutrality by firing on the German port of Tonga. Although it was the battle von Lettow hoped for, as he gathered his troops for a counterattack, he knew the odds were against him. Britain was the colonial powerhouse in the region. They had more troops, more guns, and more supplies than von Lettow. But as he watched them descend on the port, von Lettow found an advantage he had not counted on. The British docked at an unprotected harbor and took over 24 hours to unload their heavy equipment, making themselves open targets.
He was blessed in that almost all of his opponents were idiots. The British were not sending their best commanders any more than they were sending their best troops to a campaign that they knew was a sideshow, especially early in the war.
The next day, from hidden positions, von Lettow's troops struck. With only 1,000 men, 4 machine guns, and no artillery, von Lettow was crushing a force 8 times his size. And then Mother Nature stepped in and finished the job.
As the British troops are pulling back under heavy fire from the Germans, they stumble into a nest of African killer bees, who then begin to immediately swarm out in large numbers and attack the British troops as they withdraw, and the troops simply turn tail and are fleeing, and it's not clear whether they're more afraid of the German machine guns or they're more afraid of the bees.
Von Lettow captured a year's worth of supplies, weapons, and ammunition that the British had abandoned during their stinging retreat.
The victory at Tonga makes it clear that the Germans can not only fight this war, but that they can possibly win.
Crucially, of course, what it does to Lettow is it gives him the reputation of a commander with luck. He's delivered a victory, so it makes his reputation. And then, of course, it becomes a prestige question. Suddenly, Britain's position and preeminence in the African continent is potentially weakened because the Germans have actually given them a bloody nose.
The Battle of Tonga, also called the Battle of the Bees, officially kicked off the war in East Africa, a campaign as different from the war in Europe as night and day.
It's rather, from that point of view, a very exotic campaign, a campaign in which you're not actually having to watch out for heavy artillery shells, as you might be doing on the Western Front, but wondering about whether the hippopotamus is going to turn nasty or not.
This is thick jungle, very few roads, very few of the resources and military resources that people were accustomed to seeing on the Western Front. Because of the primitive road system, it's difficult to move large artillery pieces. This is a theater where forces move very, very slowly, operations happen very, very slowly, and terrain often becomes as big of an enemy as the force that you're trying to fight.
The British were burdened by their size and strength. Von Lettow had served in Africa twice before and adapted his battle strategy to the terrain. He recruited troops who knew Africa better than anyone, native soldiers called Askaris.
Von Lettow, while certainly not immune to some of the racial prejudices of his day himself, was deeply respectful of the ability of indigenous Africans to fight effectively in African terrain. They were obviously raised in this terrain, they were acclimatized to it, they had acquired partial immunity to things like malaria. Until very late in the war, the British refused to use African troops for anything but security details.
Having sent their best trained men off to the Western Front, the British brought in second-rate troops from their colony in India, many of whom arrived just days before fighting began.
The war in East Africa was understood by everybody to be a secondary or even tertiary importance to what was going on in the Western Front. The forces engaged were always very small, and the resources that the London and Berlin governments were willing to commit to Africa were always minimal.
The question for von Lettow is, how can he take this backwater and actually make it contribute to the broader German war effort against England? The only option for him is to get the British to essentially overcommit large numbers of troops to the East African theater of war that would be better used elsewhere, like in Europe.
And eventually that became the logic of the campaign, tying down the British as much as he possibly could.
We were not to wait and watch. We had to try all and everything to relieve the homeland, which would soon suffer thousands of wounds. Thus, the colony became a means for war, which was to be used to the fullest as a distraction.
The best distraction, von Lettow reasoned, would be destruction. And with that, he went on the offensive. His first target was the Uganda Railroad, Britain's main supply line and the lifeblood of war operations.
He sends small patrols of usually between 2 and 3 European officers and maybe 6 or 8 Askaris. They make their way through the very rugged terrain, the very desert terrain in that area, to the railroad. They blow up bridges, they destroy railroad ties, they even undermine the roadbed, so when they repair the railroad, they have to start from scratch. They set bombs to blow up rolling stock as the trains come down the tracks. And they're very, very clever about this.
Between March and May of 1915, von Lettow and his Askari troops blew up 32 trains and 9 bridges along the Uganda Railroad, successfully tying up hundreds of British soldiers in repairs and reconstruction. And he was just getting started.
And the British at this stage in the war are essentially running around like chickens with their heads cut off, trying to chase down von Lettow's troops of 8 or 10 guys.
The most important thing that Lettow had on his side was that he knew where he was going, and the British, of course, had to track him in order to find him, and it became very, very difficult for them to do over this jungle terrain without a lot of solid information about where Lettow was going. The advantage he had was the ability to disappear into this terrain much more easily than the British could pursue him.
The British began calling the elusive von Lettow the Phantom. Humiliated by his repeated disappearing acts, the British struggled to find someone who could fight von Lettow on his terms. In 1916, they installed a former rebel from South Africa who was well-versed in guerrilla tactics, General Jan Smuts.
He had fought against the British during the Boer War of 1899 to 1902. Later, he joined with the British in World War I for reasons of his own, for wanting to create a South African empire, and he believed that fighting on the side of Great Britain was the way to do that.
With charm and military experience, Smuts inspired trust among his troops, one of whom remarked, "Prior to Smuts coming, we were merely at war, but when he came, we began to fight." Finally, von Lettow had a formidable opponent. Over 200,000 troops would serve under Smuts, and although von Lettow was outnumbered more than 5 to 1, he refused to back down.
Here is a man, to all intents and purposes, cut off from Germany, cannot be resupplied. He's not going to get any more white officers. For example, if his German officers are killed, he's not going to get any more arms and ammunition. So any losses of men or of munitions are bad news. He should be trying to evade battle. He does not. He seeks battle in the German military tradition.
Smuts and von Lettow began their showdown at the foot of Africa's highest mountain, Kilimanjaro. In a single battle, von Lettow lost 100 men, a dangerously high percentage for his small force. Although not defeated, von Lettow had to withdraw. He could afford to lose land. He could not afford to lose more men. Von Lettow, calling Smuts his most worthy adversary, resolved to avoid any more direct combat with him.
What he decides to do is to fight the kind of war that he had seen in his experiences fighting in the colonies previously, which is to say, irregular warfare, guerrilla warfare, lightning raids, hit and run, never stand and fight except when the conditions are extremely favorable to you. Other than that, run away.
Von Lettow called his strategy taunt and delay. He and his nimble troops stayed one step ahead of the British, luring them up one side of the German colony and down the other in an exhausting circuit.
In seeking Lettow, the British are doing it in terrain where the maps are bad and intelligence is bad. They don't know exactly where Lettow is. I mean, they know roughly where he is, obviously, but they don't know exactly where his positions are, what line he is holding. They're told that there's a road there and there's no road there, or, they lose their way. So they tend to stumble into the enemy. They come under fire in the bush. They don't know what's happening. Confusion. Then the day goes, the light goes. So what do the Germans do? They withdraw, make good their escape. They do know where they're going. They do have a better grasp of the terrain.
But von Lettow did more than outrun the British. He used Africa herself as a weapon against them, trapping them in the dense jungle and drawing them into malarial swamps.
The British lost far, far more troops to disease than they ever did to combat in this war. And that was something that von Lettow did deliberately. They died in their thousands from malaria, from black water fever, from typhus, from sleeping sickness.
For every man Smuts lost to combat, he lost 30 to the toxic African elements. Of the 60,000 transport animals the British brought on their march, all but 1,000 died from tsetse fly disease.
Von Lettow, when he was marching away from British columns, didn't even have to send out patrols to know where the British were. He could tell by the stench from all of the bodies that the British were leaving along their field of march as men and horses died from disease along the route.
As they pushed further into Africa's interior, von Lettow's small force defied conditions by killing and skinning their food. Von Lettow made his own flour and salt for cooking, and replaced his troops' boot soles with soles made from hippo hide. He drew maps to avoid the worst pockets of disease, and when his men did get sick, even created an anti-malarial tonic, a potion his troops called Lettow Schnapps. Even during the worst of times, both sides insisted on a level of tradition and civility. Unlike the barbaric battlefields of Europe, the Africa campaign developed a reputation for being a gentleman's war.
They're fighting in a terrain where there has to be a mutual respect between enemies. That is, each side has to respect those men that need to be abandoned, for example, the wounded. In a situation like the combat in East Africa, you can't port your wounded with you and can't take them with you on these long treks. So both sides respected the need to care for one another's wounded, to care for one another's prisoners of war, and to extend as many courtesies as was possible.
It was in this spirit of comradeship that Smuts, having intercepted a wire transmission, sent word across enemy lines that von Lettow had been awarded a German Medal of Honor. Shortly thereafter, von Lettow was promoted to general. By the fall of 1916, after 8 months of pursuit, Smuts had chased von Lettow down the coast of German East Africa, conquering territory as he went. Finding themselves pushed up against the side of a mountain in the most brutal part of German territory, it was here that von Lettow received his ultimatum to surrender or die. Smuts and von Lettow were headed for another showdown when Smuts was abruptly called to England to help with the European war effort. Still confident of victory, Smuts assured his officers that the war in Africa would be over within weeks.
By conventional standards at this point, one would say that von Lettow has lost the war. The British have finally conquered most of German East Africa. Although they have suffered wildly disproportionate casualties in doing it, they have put in vastly more troops than they had ever intended to commit to this theater in order to do it. But they seem to have won.
But von Lettow was up to his old tricks. As the British closed in, once again, the Phantom vanished. But this time, Africa would turn on him. Heavy rains began to fall, bringing the campaign to a halt. For von Lettow and his troops, survival became its own battle.
The rivers are so broad and so high and so fast running that you can't carry on moving. The ground is churned to mud. You can't get supplies up.
With no immediate hope for resupply, von Lettow had to cut rations in half. On the verge of starvation, most of his troops were sick, and von Lettow himself had malaria. July 1917. The rains finally ended, and von Lettow went back on the run, this time in a desperate search for food. Von Lettow and his men gave up the last corner of German East Africa and entered the more fertile territory of Mozambique. Recharged and refueled, von Lettow boldly convinced his men they could make a comeback.
He then goes all the way back up Mozambique towards German East Africa again, and then turns sharp west in order to go into Rhodesia. At that juncture, he and his officers are talking about, where should we go next? Should we take the campaign into Ethiopia? Should we carry on going west? They even talk about getting a ship and maybe going off somewhere else across the Indian Ocean. I mean, they're slightly living in fantasy world.
One afternoon in 1918, 2 of von Lettow's men captured a British motorcyclist on the side of the road. He was carrying an important message. The war is over. The Germans have been defeated. For von Lettow, the news was inconceivable.
Personally, as I had no knowledge of the real state of affairs in Germany, I felt convinced that the conclusion of hostilities must have been favorable, or at least not unfavorable to Germany.
On November 11, 1918, the armistice ending World War I was signed. 2 weeks later, Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck ended his war in East Africa. He had led the British on a wild goose chase over thousands of miles of the thickest jungle and driest desert, and was the only undefeated German general of World War I. When he returned home after the war, he was exactly what the Germans needed.
In Germany, Lettow-Vorbeck is the unconquered hero. And when he comes back to Berlin, he, even more than the returning German army from the Western Front, comes back to a hero's welcome.
This was very important for the German army, which had been beaten on the Western Front, but needed to retain some of its honor and some of its own pride, and Lettow was a perfect symbol of this.
Von Lettow settled in Berlin, where he enjoyed the fruits of an advanced military career. But the Germans, devastated by their loss in the war, were suffering unprecedented economic and psychological fallout that would give rise to Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party. Von Lettow found himself on the wrong side of the Nazis and resigned his military post. He soon discovered his military pension cut in half as Germany entered yet another destructive war. (1945). World War II had trumped World War I as the deadliest in history. Europe was decimated, Germany the worst of all, having suffered another defeat. Von Lettow made it through the war, but was living in poverty in Hamburg, a forgotten general from a forgotten front. One morning, an unexpected package arrived from his former adversary, Jan Smuts. Smuts, having heard of von Lettow's plight, sent a donation of money and food to the former general, a practice he would continue for several years.
Much of the mutual respect comes from having shared in the same theater of war, having suffered through the same problems, and having treated one another's soldiers with honor and with gentlemanly conduct, which is something that many people believed had been lacking on the Western Front.
Before Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck died in 1964 at age 94, he paid one last visit to his old stomping grounds in East Africa. There, among his Askari soldiers, he was remembered as a legendary leader, one who had defied overwhelming odds and survived.
We lost it all. The planter lost his plantation, the farmer his farm, the merchant his business. We were just a few thousand, but 300,000 enemy soldiers could not defeat us.
It is actually one of the enduring fascinations of the East African campaign. It's stories of a human dimension. It is stories where individuals can actually put their imprint on this war, where somebody like Lettow-Vorbeck, instead of being overwhelmed by the enormity of the events, can actually dominate the events. It's a war story with a human face, unlike so much of the Western Front.